Okay, my obsessive compulsive side is wondering what the prelude actually was here. So I'm going to guess God Beyond All Knowing by Benjamin Britten. Correct or wrong?
Now God Beyond All Praising.
Now God Beyond All Praising by?
Holst.
By Holst. Completely wrong. Okay. So now you know it anyway. Okay. Very good. Okay. Well, it's interesting. The gospel lesson for today is said to be one of the most difficult gospels to preach on. So, but actually maybe for me it's somewhat of a cop-out preaching on that because after all there was that 1 Timothy lesson, which I think might have been more dangerous for me to preach on, particularly since a certain person is sitting behind me close to a large metal object. But in any case, I think whether you're dealing with the gospel lesson or the 2 Timothy, or the lesson from 1 Timothy, that really you can only really understand it by thinking about the context in which it is spoken and understanding that. And so when it comes to looking at that gospel lesson, we find that often people on the face of it at first reading are rather confused by it because after all, you here have the story of a dishonest steward. And yet it seems when you read the gospel lesson that in some ways Jesus is sort of condoning some of the actions of that man, and indeed in some ways lifting him up as an example. So it is important that we look at the context of it. And I think the first thing we need to remember is really what is a steward? What is a steward? And you know, when you think about stewardship, it really goes to the heart of human identity. I mean, after all, consider when Adam is created. One of the first tasks he's given is to name the living creatures. And naming in the Bible, knowing in the Bible, really means the exercise also of power and authority. So right from the beginning, human beings are given power and authority acting in God's name. And a good kind of way of thinking about stewardship is that God provides for every need with great generosity. We are to be good caretakers of that we have been entrusted with through his love. And if you go to the Small Catechism and read the explanation of the first article of the Creed, there's a wonderful statement about really stewardship and how blessed we are to be stewards of God's creation. Where it says, I believe that God has made me and all creatures, that he has given me my body and soul, eyes, ears, and all my members, my reason and all my senses, and still takes care of them. He also gives me clothing and shoes, food and drink, house and home, wife and children, land, animals, all I have. He richly and daily provides me with all that I need to support this body and life. He defends me against all danger and guards and protects me from all evil. All this he does only out of fatherly, divine goodness and mercy, without any merit or worthiness in me. For all this is my duty to thank and praise, serve, and obey him. So really, stewardship is not sort of just, oh boy, Stewardship Sunday, bring out the wallet, bring out the checkbook, that kind of thing. It is a wonderful opportunity, stewardship, to thank God for all that he gives to us, not just once, but on a daily, ongoing basis. And it involves much more than just our possessions itself. It really talks about our stewardship of creation, our daily care for the world around us and for one another. So in light of this, we look at the Gospels and we look at the stories of Jesus, including the one today, and we put it sort of in a context. And unfortunately, what we often find there is that Jesus, in the stories he tells about stewards, often presents their response to the love of God as really kind of a mixed bag. Let's be honest. So you can go back, for example, to Matthew 18. There you would find the story of the unforgiving steward. There is a man at the beginning of the story who has been forgiven a huge debt to God. One would think he would be overwhelmed with thanksgiving and charitableness, not only towards God, but to one another. But instead, he goes and finds the man who owes him something, and he practically wrings his neck, give me the money! He throws him into prison. For this, the man is condemned. Or you can go to Luke 19, and there's a story of the 10 servants, each one given a pound of money, which was about 3 months' wages. And there we find that some of the stewards do a good kind of job. They actually sort of multiply the money, and for this they are rewarded. They're given the management over cities, kind of a real promotion. But there's this one guy who's so afraid of the owner that he just clings to the money. He doesn't do anything with it. He just sort of holds on to it. He's sort of paralyzed in fear. And at the conclusion of the story, we hear, well, that man, he has that pound of money just taken away from him. He is, in a sense, judged for what he has not done. What about Luke 20? There's another story. This one is not just about one people or 10 people, but rather a collective of people, the tenants of the vineyard. They were given a vineyard by their owner who established the vineyard, made sure that everything was right, and then they were left in charge of it while he went away. And what do we hear? Those tenants of the vineyard try and usurp it. They try and steal ownership from the actual owner. The owner is very charitable towards them. He sends one delegation after another, but all those delegations are violently rejected until he sends his own son. Right? The history of God's relations with his people, really. And they even kill him. Well, guess what happens to them? They're condemned too. Right? So within that context, we come to today's lesson. And here we find a man who is quite honestly questionable. Right? The title of this passage is The Dishonest Steward. And it tells you a little bit about his character, isn't it? But notice the very first thing. The first thing that happens to him is he's accountable for his action. He's fired by the owner of the vineyard. Now this is kind of telling in and of itself. You know, when I first went to seminary, which was way back in the last century sometime, at Gettysburg Seminary, I got there and it was interesting. My first year, I kind of detected a problem. And what I kind of saw was that the idea of forgiveness was being almost fully separated or contrasted with consequences for one's action. In other words, what I heard sometimes being proclaimed is that you can only forgive if you also forgive people any consequences for what they do for you. Well, that's kind of dangerous. And now I'm looking kind of back on it, we live in this relativist society. Well, what you want to do is okay. What I want to do, it seems that in some ways the seedbed for that was there. Because after all, God has said we have consequences for actions. Let's look at those parables I just told you. Remember, in our Lutheran understanding, there is a left and a right hand of God. There is the church, which preaches both law and gospel. Law to drive people to the gospel. And then there's also the other kingdom, the left-hand kingdom of God, the government, which is given the authority to really subdue wrongdoers and hold them in place. So how this kind of works out, right, is let's say one of you were to get caught with a DUI. God forbid, right? I would come and visit you as your pastor, right? And I would say good things, hopefully like, tomorrow is a new day, right? God is a forgiving God. You can work on this and make changes in your life, and you are a child of God. I would say all those good things. But the reality is I might be visiting you in jail. Right? And now some people would say, well, that's terrible, isn't it, that you go to jail? But wait a minute. It's the left-hand authority, right? You have to have consequences for your action. And that can also still be from God. Indeed, for many people, that's what they need to get back to God, to understand they're responsible for their actions. And so the steward is right away fired. There are consequences for what we do in life, and there need to be. But then notice an interesting thing about this steward. He's kind of an interesting character in my book. Sort of shady, but sort of intriguing, too. He says to himself, I've got a problem. I've been fired, but you know what? I don't like to do manual labor. I'm just not strong enough. In other words, probably pretty lazy, right? And also, I'm just a little too proud to beg. I have too much pride really needed to beg. Now, when we hear that, at first, what we say, well, that guy just condemned himself, didn't he? Talk about self-incrimination. But then, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, at least this guy knows the truth about himself. And that is always the first step to change, isn't it? You know, when you read the Gospels, one thing you soon realize is that if there's one thing that really annoys Jesus, it is a self-righteous hypocrite, isn't it? Have you ever noticed that? Listening, you know, the publican, right? Oh, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, right? The guy runs a bar, right? Versus the Pharisee, always trying to obey the law. What does he say? Oh, thank God I'm not like that other guy who's there. Right? So, here we have this guy, the steward, and he knows who he is. And as bad as that is, he can still act. This isn't the story about the steward who went on the land. He at least is facing the situation. And that's a good thing. And then look at what happens. Right? The steward calls the people who owe the owner the debt. He calls them to his office, and he hustles. He says, what do you owe? $100. Oh, there, right out of here. See ya, bye. See, now he's not like the unforgiving steward, right? Remember the other story? That unforgiving steward was murdered. Sometimes when people are in a panic, they get really mean, don't they? They get to be more like themselves in some ways. But he has enough smarts. Now, if you really study this, it's kind of interesting because, you know, Palestine was a kleptocracy. It was a corrupt society. Everybody was on the land. Everybody was on the tape. And so what would have happened was when they talked about the price of the owner, what was always part of it was the commission to the steward. So what he's really doing there, he's forgiving people the commission that he put on top of the money that was owed him. So in the end, he's getting nothing out of the deal for himself, but he's getting back the master's money. And so, one way or another, even if his motivations aren't the best, it's a win-win situation for the people. Right? The people owe the money, they don't owe the commission on top of things. The owner, he's getting his money back. It works out. This is what, you know, sometimes we call enlightened self-interest, right? The beauty of capitalism when it really works, right? People, you know, I benefit, you benefit. This is a good thing. And Jesus really, in a sense, acknowledges it. So the man acts. He does something, and the end result is good. The motivations may not be the best, but it is accomplished. A good thing is done. You know, one of the dangers in our society today is something called scrupulosity. Have you heard of that word, scrupulosity? Now, most of us would say it's good to have scruples, right? It's good to be thinking about what is right and what is wrong. It is good to be doing the right thing, to have scruples. We don't want to be the opposite of that, be a sociopath, right? That would be pretty bad. But what happens when we become so concerned with doing what we think is right that we are paralyzed, or that we use it as a weapon? Our whole society right now is in danger of this. You know, it's almost gotten to the point where if you are a leader who does anything controversial at all, one thing that is guaranteed is somebody's looking into your background. Have you noticed that? Somebody is going to be out to get you. Right? And so they're going to, if something happens, let's say it's something you did 20 years ago, maybe it was stupid, maybe it was something dumb. I mean, in some cases it is a real concern, don't get me wrong. But maybe it was something done, you're going to be held accountable for that, right? It's almost as though people expected you to be perfect. Try being perfect in an imperfect world. Go to the store and buy the clothes. And if you're concerned about buying everything in America, good thing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it was in some ways? But you know what? You're probably going to end up in a nudist colony. Right? So it's not going to work. It's not. We're so scrupulous. What happens is, because we're sinful beings, we then turn that into a weapon against others. Isn't that what the Pharisees did in some ways? We have this law, we perfectly there. You're a sinner, you're a tax collector, you're out of the kingdom of God. Jesus comes along and says, come on, folks, I know you're not perfect. Guess what? I love you anyway. So as bad as somehow this steward's motivations are, he gets the job done. And there we get that kind of zinger, where Jesus actually says, you know what? Sometimes the actions of these shrewd people are really smarter than you righteous people out there. What are you accomplishing? Sometimes I think this in relation to the churches. You know, most of our churches have been around a long time. A lot of churches in York County, 100 years, 200 years, maybe more than that. And yet, quite often, in a world where more and more people are becoming secularized, where more and more people are abandoning God, becoming atheists, agnostic, don't care one way or the other, what do churches often do? Argue about who's plugging in the coffee pot. Or not, thankfully not ours. We are blessed, believe me. Because I hear about other churches, and they're breaking apart for all kinds of dumb reasons. This person said this person said that, this kind of thing like that. Maybe we should go along with the culture, because I just know that if everybody knows how hip and modern and relativistic we are, we're just going to grow the church. It never happens. It's not meant to be. The church today has to figure out, how are we going to reach these people? What are we going to do to these lost generations? We have to be shrewd enough, in a sense, to hustle, to get the word out. But it's a good word, and we don't have the right to mess it up, to change it, to fit the culture, to say, if I just change this and that, I know somebody's going to love me. That's like high school. The church has an enduring, truthful message. It has to speak the truth. But it has to speak it. Otherwise, more and more people will be lost. Well, it's kind of interesting. When we reach the end of the story, which probably many of you are glad that we have, but when you reach the end of the story, because here what we find is that it's an interesting conclusion. This man is really not condemned. This man is not rewarded. We don't really know what's going to happen to him. I mean, he's sort of basing on a kind of shaky premise. What he's thinking is, because he lowered the debt of those people, they're going to welcome him into his home. Have you ever tried to call in sort of a favor for somebody? It might last one time or twice. Try it 3 times. You're out the door. So he's got a shaky future. He's the hustler. He's relying on himself. But God says, don't rely on this. What are you going to love more, basically? Are you going to love God more, or are you going to love the things of this world? If you love the things of this world, you're going to come up empty. If you love God, the God who loves you, the God who forgives you, then you will be filled. After all, as I was thinking about this lesson this week, a sudden kind of creepy realization came over me. I'm not all that different from that steward. After all, so often in my life, I look at the things that I have as mine. Owning me, owned by me. After all, I have an incredible debt to God to pay that I can never pay back, because he died on the cross for me. In a lot of ways, I'm like that steward. But yet, the word given to me and to you is we are precious in his sight. That debt has been forgiven on the cross. we have new life. And he enters our very life in his body and blood. He intermingles his love with us in such a way that we might know that we are indeed blessed. And we are to be good stewards out of thankfulness.